Welcome to today's New England Hymns premier sponsor webinar presented by Wolf & Company, titled Introduction to Automating Attacks and Validating Assumptions, presented by Alex Martirosyan, Manager, Lead Penetration Tester, OSCP, GTEN at Wolf's IT Assurance Services Group, where he's responsible for coordinating and conducting penetration testing services for clients in a variety of industries, including financial, healthcare, and software. His expertise consists of internal and external network penetration testing, threat and emulation exercises, social engineering, vulnerability assessments, cloud security assessments, and Active Directory security reviews. All lines have been muted upon entry today, so please send your questions via the Q&A feature, and Alex will answer them throughout the presentation. Please join me in welcoming Alex today.
Awesome. Thank you for that introduction. Welcome, everyone, to Introduction to Automating Attacks and Validating Assumptions. For today's session, just as a brief overview, who am I? Like I was mentioned, I'm one of the lead.
Oh, Alex, you just muted. Can you hear us?
Oh. Can you hear me now?
Yep,
Zoom
now
is
I can
playing
hear
with
you.
my audio.
Sorry about that. Okay,
let's retry again. Like I was mentioned, I'm Alex Martirosyan. I'm one of the lead penetration testers for our DenSecure group, which is part of the Wolf Advisory Services practice. I initially started as an IT auditor, and I mainly mentioned that for this session as it helped me understand of how we can incorporate those types of audit practices and understanding how we're actually validating our defenses and controls internally. I know that's not the most fun or attractive. Everyone loves dealing with auditors, but I do credit a lot of this thinking in terms of how we'll be walking through the session and what I credited towards actually rethinking how we're performing offensive security tests or validating that our defenses are supposed to be working as they've been designed. I also graduated with a degree in mathematics. So I'm interested in that intersection where mathematics and security meet. But I mainly mention that because with all my presentations, I lean off of how I was educated from my professors. We always start with a problem statement or try to motivate how we actually got here, which I hope to do later in the session as well. So as a brief agenda, we'll be walking through some basic definitions, frameworks, and matrices just to get into the same understanding and just defining how we actually got here, of why I think automating attacks and understanding how we actually actively test our security controls is greatly important, especially with the current landscape of what we see in the news. We saw, for example, major healthcare providers being hit with ransomware. United Health, for example, is in the news. Actors are getting in, so I hope to at least lay the framework in terms of how we actually got here, the historical trends, and what we're seeing, and how we can actually bolster our defenses by employing offensive security testing, by playing the role of that malicious actor. I'll also go through how to actually map and perform these tests. These tests can be done at very low cost of entry. A lot of the tools and techniques I'll be walking through are free and open source. So I'm hoping to at least provide some overview of how you should perform this testing internally yourself as well. So how do we get here? So I mentioned it earlier, but actors are still getting in. It's not that surprising. I play the role as a penetration tester as I get to play the role of a hacker. I try to break into organizations using a variety of skills and techniques, and we try to emulate that from what we're seeing in the news of how attackers are actually getting in. So since they're being successful, they're performing social engineering-based attacks of sending a phishing email with a link asking for credentials within that landing page. Maybe they're calling the help desk, for example. We see that commonly now, where an attacker will impersonate as an end user or an administrator. They'll call the help desk and ask for a credential to be rotated. That's referred to as a phishing and phone calls attacks to gain initial access. Ransomware itself has been ingrained as in our society as an industry. They've been able to create this crime syndicate in organizations where they're able to have specific expertise or skill sets and diversify their own ways that they're operating, where they have specific teams and professionals targeting aspects of an operation. For example, they'll have people that are really well versed in gaining initial access, people that are really skilled at sending social engineering emails or performing the initial access of getting credentials or collecting credentials, and pivot off where now they have different teams operating as a service almost to some extent. So with that, we know that they're being successful. The actors are at least gaining access. A lot of the focus in the past decade or so in security has always been focusing on the firewall or the perimeter, right? The perimeter can be thought of, we're blocking access to our internal networks, we're blocking access to EHR or any PHI that any actor can actually get, because we're hoping that a firewall or some solution could protect us from the internet and all the nasty stuff that goes around in the background. That's clearly not working, right? People, we're still seeing major organizations still getting breached. MGM as another example. Microsoft in November, for example, was breached by Russian state actors where they simply just guessed a password, right, to this legacy application, and they were able to gain access to Microsoft accounts themselves through that technique. So it's still working. And I don't mean to reference that as a doom and gloom scenario, but I think the shift in focus in the industry is important to recognize, that we can no longer think in this legacy way that we're always going to block and attack. And yes, prevention is definitely a key component in us thinking of why and where we place our defenses, but that focus has changed. So on this slide, what I want to break down here is just an understanding why or how we got here to think that although we can't prevent all attackers, we need to understand what we can control to ensure that we can at least detect them and evict them and ensure that we can block their actions before they can actually accomplish their objectives, which in the worst case scenario could be ransomware or exfiltration of data. So with that understanding, we have two different pyramids here. And I don't know who came up with the security world of using these pyramids. It's not a pyramid scheme or anything like that. But the left-hand pyramid was created originally by a security professional, David Bianco. And what he outlines here is what is really difficult to control from a defensive perspective, and from an offensive perspective, what's also difficult to control. What I mean by that is, for an attacker, it's really difficult to modify behaviors. So at the very top, what I want you to focus on the left-hand side or the left-hand pyramid is in the very top hand, we have tactics, techniques, and procedures. We can think of that as behaviors. So every morning, for example, I need caffeine to start my day. I need a coffee or an espresso. And I've tuned out a habit to drink an espresso or have a coffee by 9 in the morning. That's a behavior we can think of it as. And if you modify that behavior, if you block an obstacle, if I no longer get that caffeine that I'm looking for, all of a sudden my entire day is going to be shifted. I need to get some sort of caffeine source. I need to think of something else. The same can be thought of from a defensive perspective or an attacker. If we're modifying or at least placing obstacles of what we can control from a behavior perspective, that is going to be the biggest lift for us to be able to defend against. And the attacker needs to have a high cost to be able to coordinate how they're actually modifying that behavior, right? They need to, there's a huge cost that goes into their own developments of tools and tactics and techniques that if you block, for example, the way that they're going to gather credentials or the way that they're going to pivot off to different systems, which we'll get into, but just think about that at a high level. They have their own behaviors of how they operate, right? I mentioned there's a crime syndicate, there's people professionals they have this highly technical skill sets and how they actually operate. Well, we'll go into specific details of where we know and what they actually do. And if we know how those types of behaviors, if we know how they're operating, we could place obstacles along the way, whether it be preventative measures or detective measures, to be able to then evict them or ensure that they can't actually accomplish what they're aiming to get to. At the bottom hand of that pyramid, we have things that are easier to modify from both an attacker perspective and detect from a defensive perspective. So that's called hash values. I don't want to go too much in the technical weeds, but you could think of that as, for malware, for example, if you're bringing in malware to an environment, if a user clicks on that link, they get a phishing email, they click on a link, and there's software that gets downloaded onto the machine. From an attacker perspective, I can modify that malware and make new malware every time. Where if you're only detecting or preventing that one file or that bad value, yes, you could detect it very easily and it's easy for you to do so, but so is changing that file name or changing the type of file attributes itself from an attacker perspective. So that's why the focus a lot of in the defensive space, and this pyramid's not perfect by any means, but at least helps the ground lay the foundation of why a lot of our defensive tooling and where we got there is now focusing on behavior based. We're looking to detect and prevent behaviors and less so about the types of tools. And while those are still important, we're still blocking domain names, those bad domains, we're blocking bad IP addresses, et cetera. That's still important and still valuable. But a lot of the focus now is going to go towards blocking behaviors and how we understand attacker methodology. And during the session, what we hope to establish is if we understand attacker methodology, if we understand what they're doing, we could test our defenses first using that same methodology, and then understand what our extra controls are looking at and how they would operate against a similar type of threat. Unfortunately, we have a trust issue in cybersecurity in our industry. We're probably one of the only industries in the entire world, or whatever you think of it as, that we buy or spend hundreds of thousands of dollars for.
Alex, we lost your audio again.
I'm not sure.
Oh, there
Let's
you
try
are.
again.
You're back. Okay.
For me, Zoom. I'm not
Sorry,
sure
we
why
just-
Zoom is cutting in and out. Apologies. I was referencing we're probably one of the only industries where we spend hundreds of thousands of dollars to ensure that we have these defenses. You maybe buy a new service like an endpoint detection response solution like CrowdStrike, Microsoft Defender, SentinelOne, or it could be a managed service where you're expecting that this team is going to defend and detect a threat and alert you to that fact. But unfortunately, what's happening in our industry is we don't get to test that until a threat actor is performing the similar types of tests for you, where they're actually in and testing your own defenses first before we are. So hopefully by this session, you could start understanding of how we could perform our own security tests internally based on the threats and behaviors that we're observing in the wild of what we know these actors are, how they're actually getting in, how they're breaching networks, and then perform similar types of tests internally against those types of threats and understand of not only assuming what our controls should be doing, but actually validating them in the background as well. The right-hand pyramid's a little bit newer. It's from Christopher Peacock. He works for Scythe, but they're a purple team exercise or framework itself to perform these types of assessments themselves. But they established a newer framework to kind of think of this that extends the pyramid on the left of we understand that there's tactics involved of how operators may try to get credentials, or that may be a goal, a tactical goal for attackers. There's techniques of how they'll actually be getting those credentials. But then the most important, at least from an intelligence perspective, is how they're actually doing it, the exact tool and how they're actually successfully collecting credentials is a procedure. And we'll get into defining that in just a little bit. So this may be new to some people, but I mentioned the endpoint detection response solutions. And this is going to be a large focal point in our session of just understanding that, because that's probably the best understanding of how this shift in the industry has occurred, of where a lot of defenses have been going. It's really on the endpoint now. But MITRE ATT&CK is a classification scheme. We could think of it as. You maybe are familiar with it if you're of IT security teams, or maybe this is completely new. But MITRE ATT&CK is a framework and a classification scheme that allows us to essentially, as practitioners or people in the offensive security space, we could break down the common language that we'll use of, if I say credential gathering, I can ascribe a specific ID, meaning I can use that same type of language to communicate that to a defender. So really why I bring this up is this is essentially how we're going to be able to classify actions, where if I tell you that MGM got hacked in these specific ways, we called out that the help desk scenario where individuals are calling or threat actors are calling individuals to change a password, or a password-based attack where individuals are guessing credentials and they're able to guess a credential to a Microsoft account. We can ascribe and talk about that at a high level. The MITRE ATT&CK framework allows us to classify that action to some specific ID to ensure that we're all talking about the same type of language. I don't have the entire matrix in front here just because it would be a little bit too overwhelming, but I invite you to explore it on your own time just to be able to get a sense of how practitioners or how the security community is actually classifying these attacks or techniques. And we're going to use that then to then actually be able to automate and test our own controls. And it's important to just recognize that, yes, it's a matrix, but it's not necessarily a checkbox. The MITRE ATT&CK framework or matrix is meant to allow us to understand of how these attacks are actually being performed and classified, but these are known and observed attacks. MITRE ATT&CK also performs annual evaluations. So if you haven't seen this, it's an open, essentially assessment, an evaluation where MITRE is performing an assessment that we're kind of talking about here. They choose a threat actor and a threat profile and perform a targeted assessment against a solution. It could be an endpoint detection response solution. It could be a CrowdStrike, SentinelOne. It could be a managed detection response solution from Microsoft, Red Canary, you name it. It's an open collaborated assessment where all the results are public and transparent to be able to assess and see how these solutions are actually working. Unfortunately, it's turned into a little bit of everyone claims that they're 100% aligned to MITRE ATT&CK and we're all winning cybersecurity, which is definitely not the case. But it's a transparent platform to be able to at least assess of how these solutions are actually working and defending against these attacks for you to kind of transparently identify which solution may be working best for your analyst or why you'd want to choose one solution over the other. But I guess the key point here is if you look at that matrix, don't treat it as a checklist or a way to at least assess your controls. It's really merely just a classification scheme that allows us to talk about the same sort of activities. So what does that actually look like? So before we actually automate an attack or figure out how do we actually choose a threat profile that we want to test against, right? The whole point here is if we are really concerned about ransomware, for example, we know that there's ransomware operations carried out. We can identify intelligence, meaning it could be either publicly accessible to us, it could be privately accessible to us as well. Whatever that intelligence comes from, it could be in the form of something like this, where it's defining how an actor actually did some specific action, whether it be they gained additional access to an endpoint by doing X, Y, and Z, or it could be they gathered credentials from the system and then they moved off to this EHR system or database server, and they were able to exfiltrate data using this tool or procedure outside of the network. They have the data now, and they were able to publish it online. That's a English statement, right? We're talking now basic layman terms of what happened, but then we could start classifying them in specific actions. On the left-hand side, what you'll see is that statement of kind of what I'm describing. It's what a threat actor was able to accomplish. And in bold, in the parentheses, you'll start seeing these identifiers. That's the MITRE ATT&CK classification of essentially defining and classifying these specific actions to a technique. So T1204 is a specific technique that classifies in layman's terms what actually this threat actor did. We then can cite the intelligence where it came from. It should be probably recent enough for us to care about, right? We're caring about if we're a hospital system, if we're in the healthcare industry, we care about ransomware. We should be caring about how ransomware actors are targeting specifically healthcare organizations. So if we could identify that relevant intelligence, if we could bring that in of understanding how they're actually doing it, well, we can then look at this intelligence and actually test it ourselves. So we can create our own plan where we're identifying and classifying these techniques to then actually test it against our own systems and defenses internally. If I care about this threat, I could be proactive and say, this is really important. I think this type of ransomware attack or this type of attack that occurred in my industry is important, and I want to test for it, where I can create this plan, I could cite the intelligence, and then bring it into my own organization to actively test my own defenses. A more recent example, so Black Hat is the ransomware gang that targeted the massive healthcare provider for United Health itself. They essentially have intelligence on them of how they operate. How do they gain initial access? What do they actually do to get credentials? And you don't necessarily need to know the technical details, right? We don't necessarily need to go super deep in the weeds of how they're actually doing it, but we can start classifying and speaking about a little bit more in an intelligent way that allows us to classify and then ask the question to our security teams, ask the question to our IT teams of how can we actually audit for this ourselves, right? So Black Hat, for example, is a ransomware affiliate. We know that they're actually impersonating and posing as that IT help desk staff, and then calling or using SMS-based messages of actually picking up the phone and calling employees to try and get credentials. That's a technique. Now, it's a question of, do we have the means and is it feasible for us to test internally that ourselves, or do we need a third party? That's obviously a different question. But now I have enough information where I care about Black Hat, because Black Hat, this group, this cyber crime group, is successfully infiltrating or gaining access to organizations that are similar in size and complexity. That now I can at least understand what behaviors they're doing. They're calling individuals, they're performing these social engineering based attacks, and I can assess and validate, at least in my own defenses, of how we actually stack up against that threat. Now, some things are easier to test than others, obviously, and we could prioritize those types of techniques that we really care about. For example, at the very end of the table, this is from the CISA report, but a lot of intelligence and reports that you'll find now are starting to use a MITRE ATT&CK framework to classify those techniques, where you could pull this intelligence really anywhere from the internet, just this public report, or it could be private if you have the sort of intelligence being spread in the community itself. So, for example, we know that they steal or force Kerberos tickets. I don't necessarily need to know anything about Kerberos to at least now know that, hey, this is a behavior that Alpha Black Hat is actually performing, and this is how they're being successful in their operations. And I could just simply pose the question, well, okay, they're doing this Kerberos ticket stealing and forging it. How do we actually stack up? Does our control environment is able to detect it? Do we have a process to prevent those types of abuses? Those are the types of questions that we could start asking ourselves, because it's a recent intelligence. We know it exists and it's important to us, and we can start testing for ourselves. We can actually perform the same procedure internally and get the outcome of not only assuming that our controls are working, but actually validating that they're stacked up and working as intended. So I mentioned endpoint detection response solutions. That's the endpoints has been a big focus in the past couple of years to defend against, because that's commonly where a breach occurs, where an attacker needs to establish a breachhead. They need a foothold into a computer, and from a computer, they start pivoting off to different servers. It could be a database, it could be an application, for example, your EHR or whatever the case is. The attacker still needs to start from an endpoint. So a lot of the focus in the past couple of years has been ensuring that an endpoint detection response solution, your CrowdStrikes, your SentinelOnes, Microsoft Defender for Endpoint, McAfee, you name it, choose your vendor, it doesn't really matter. But these tools have been starting to really get into the industry, and they make bold claims occasionally of saying that they are 100% perfect and there's a threat that can never get by. We obviously know that's not happening, right? Attackers are still being successful in how they're operating. You pick any threat that you name it, and you'll see at least some sort of breach report occurring in our industry. But I guess the key point here, at least for this slide, is just understanding what the main advantage is. And this may be a surprising shock, but you may think that an endpoint detection response solution, when you buy CrowdStrike or you have those solutions, you may expect that the key focal point of that is protection, right? You want it to prevent those types of attacks from ever occurring, or it automatically quarantine, isolate a system if it starts detecting malicious activity. The truth of the matter is those controls are configured in a default manner. And ideally, the key advantage of those tools is really telemetry, meaning that the data that you get from that tool, and it's up to you as whether it be an analyst or whoever you have on your team, to actually tune that tool and monitor and actually actively identify threats. It's going to have defaults to be able to block and prevent those abuses. That's where we saw in the pyramid of pain, right? We saw the files and bad stuff that's going to get blocked automatically. But attackers also know that they can test their own. They can buy their own EDRs. They could test it. They could test their own behaviors and understand of what's going to actually get through. And really, what's king for and how powerful these endpoint detection response solutions are, it's really telemetry, the data that you get out of that sensor, and being able to use that data in a meaningful way. And it's important to at least tune your defenses against knowing what those defaults are and how those behaviors actually operate. Because unfortunately, if you're under the assumption that that default or preventative policy that you have is going to protect you, you may be surprised based on some of the techniques that are actually successful and how these actors are actually still operating, even with advancements of these types of tools, because it has shifted. The defensive solutions have gone way better from the past couple of years. We're no longer just relying on basic antivirus software where it's just performing the hash value check. These are advanced systems and they're very powerful tools, but there's no silver bullet in cybersecurity, right? There's no singular solution that's going to solve all of this. Each individual control that we have is stacked up in these layered defenses that we're hoping to at least catch malicious activity and be able to respond to it accordingly as it arises. So this quote on this page here is just kind of describing this fact a little bit in more detail. This is taken from CISA themselves. So CISA is where you could start understanding what they think about endpoint detection response solutions. If you don't trust me itself, you can see their quote here where by default, for example, the Windows operating system, essentially what they're saying is not securely designed. So a lot of our technology that we use internally to support our systems and applications and how we're accessing data and interfacing with application, how we're training employees, these systems by default are not secure. They have a wider attack surface compared to something like a secure by design operating system like Chromebooks and iOS. And yes, the statement here is not to say that, yeah, drop the Windows operating system or bash on Microsoft. And if you go to Chromebooks, you'll be completely solving cybersecurity and be secured. But it's just an interesting thought experiment that we have more risk because of the businesses and technologies that we have to support in order to support our customers, in order to support any members, or whatever the case is. We have a stronger or bigger attack surface that attackers are going to target, and we need to start defending against that. We can't just assume that a default or what the technology that we're going to be using is secure by default. And that's especially more true now with cloud providers and what we're seeing in the industry as a whole. So why do we care at a grand scheme of things? Why do we actually care about any of this? So understanding threats is going to allow us and enable us to then defend against them in a more meaningful way, where threats have some sort of intent. They have a capability where, whether it be a crime organization or ransomware operator, they have a capability and they're limited by the means of what sophistication, right? Even though that every breach report of response is going to say that this was a sophisticated cybersecurity attack, a lot of times the intelligence will break down and say, well, all they did was just pick up a phone and call someone, or they guessed a password from the internet. So the threats have varying levels of sophistication. We don't necessarily need to care about everyone as much as we want to feel like, especially Unicorn, for example, we're not going to be targeted by a Russian nation state. Not everyone's going to be targeted by a Russian nation state. So we don't necessarily need to defend against that types of techniques or behaviors, right? Not every cyber attack is going to be as sophisticated as the SolarWinds breach. Many of them are going to be, unfortunately, just low-level operators of ransomware, just performing that mass social engineering campaign, getting credentials, and getting in. So that's why you should really align yourself to at least threat modeling what is important to you. Maybe you are an organization that's going to ascribe to a level of a nation state, but that's a completely different scenario compared to a ransomware operator and gang. Finally, threats have an opportunity. They're going to be targeting the lowest barrier of entry, right? If you think about that, attackers move like water. That's one of my favorite quotes from Microsoft, one of their defensive cybersecurity blogs. But if you understand that, to the high level attackers are going to move like water. They're going to take the path of least resistance. So if there's not many of those obstacles that are preventing or blocking them from the behavior-based approach that I was talking about, they're going to maybe target someone easier. They're not going to go after someone with a lot of more defenses or where they have to use a lot of cost, because A, that's resources on their part or facilitating their own gang and different operators, but it's also time. So they don't have the luxury of just attacking people at will. If there's a lot of different defenses, they're going to target someone with less security or a way that they can actually achieve a foothold. And yes, they've been less discriminatory of who they're targeting. They're going to target anyone. But they still have that at least cost element to it, where they're doing very non-sophisticated attacks or techniques, unfortunately, and still getting in and having that success that they're having to then carry out their objectives. So how does this look at a high level of what you could build out internally? So again, a MITRE attack is not that checkbox. We're just using it to classify techniques and get to that common language. But we can start using threat intelligence to build that profile, build that model of who we care about in a given series of tests. Maybe it's every quarter we're doing these types of tests. Every year we're doing these types of tests. But we're identifying a profile that we care about, identifying the security controls that we want to test. That could be your EDR. It could be your SIM. It could be your full stack of even incident response to some extent, right? How do actually your analysts or your people internally actually respond to an incident? Are they doing the right things? Are your managed service providers of the people we entrust to actually detect or respond to these types of events if it happens, are they doing the right things in the background as well? And that's how we can actively test them. We can actively test them, and we're the ones testing them first before the actor is. And it doesn't have to be super involved of these really high level technical details, right? You don't necessarily need a third party to come in to do this massive long campaign. And maybe you are at that level or not, but start simple first, right? Starting simple of grabbing intelligence, just asking a basic question internally of depending where you're at on your journey of maturity. But you can ask those basic questions to individuals of saying, hey, I saw in the news, or if you're getting questions from your board or committees, we're really concerned about this Black Hat, Alpha Cat ransomware. This ransomware gang got in here. How do we fare? And you can come prepared of actually assessing your own control environment. Say, this is where we're at from a maturity scale of we feel confident based on this threat and how they operate. We know how they operate based on recent reports of this is what they're going to do. And we've assessed our control environments be maybe these are the gaps that exist, or these are the opportunities that we've identified that actually are working to defend against those types of techniques. So emulation challenges themselves. So that's one way to at least think about this, or how you could develop your own plan. But there are challenges to this, right? So malicious actors, they don't care if you classify their techniques using an attack framework. And the attack framework is really only built off of observed techniques, things that we know are happening. So there's obviously going to be some percentage or threats that are unobserved until they get added into the MITRE ATT&CK framework. The MITRE ATT&CK framework is a community-driven process where people are updating it continuously. They're trying to identify new techniques or procedures that threat actors have been using and updating that resource. But since it's based on observed and really a targeted effort to ensure that it is accurate, there's going to be unobserved tactics, techniques, and procedures that are just not there. And actors, they don't care how you classify their actions. They're just going to perform those types of techniques themselves. The second piece of this is that you need viable intelligence. And what I didn't mention initially is that although we have an idea of how some of these attacks are occurring, one of the biggest faults in our industry is we don't really communicate effectively. We're not actually describing how this breach actually occurred in a meaningful way. Going back to the pyramid slide, I mentioned procedures is really important for us to understand, right? We need to understand procedures of how these actors are actually carrying out these attacks. What are the exact tools? Tell me the exact command line that these operators or how these attackers are actually using and gaining access. That's information that's important, because then I can take that intelligence and actually do the same action. A lot of the tooling that these malicious actors are doing are usually open source. Some of them are commercial. Some of them are obviously private. But if we understand that, we could then test our own defenses against it. And if we're in an industry that doesn't communicate of all we're saying is we get breached, but we don't say how or what happened, we don't have intelligence to work off of, and we're kind of just at a whim of, unfortunately, just relying on these defenses and just ensuring that they're working. But that's why I think in our industry, I'm hoping that people will start collaborating a little bit more and be a little bit open. Obviously, nobody wants to say they were a victim of a breach, and that's a very difficult conversation to have. But if we're a little bit more open and transparent of, hey, this is what we're observing in the industry. We're seeing that these actors are maybe getting this way through into our defenses. This is what they're doing. That sort of intelligence is very important for us to then be able to assess our own environments and validate that the defenses are working internally. And then lastly, we may not have the resource or capabilities to do this. And we may need to have different teams or different parties to help assist with this. But I do think it's important to at least consider this aspect of it. It's a specific use case for offensive security testing that will help validate your assumptions and ensure that your defenses, again, are working as they're intended or as they're purchased. So this is a graphic from MITRE Ingenuity. That's the team that runs the attack evaluations. And this is how you could start thinking about the maturity scale of what you could perform, at least from a simple perspective, and then a little bit more complicated assessment. And I'm hoping to break down these types of testing plans just so you understand what is out there in terms of how you can actually facilitate these types of tests. Atomic testing is the simplest form. So if this is the first time you're hearing anything about this from an offensive security test perspective, atomic testing is probably where you should start. Atomic testing is a fancy way of saying that we're going to take a specific procedure, just one action, and then run it and see what the outcome is. As an example, it could be as simple as I'm going to open up my command prompt and run who am I? That's a common technique actually used by operators. They'll run who am I, for example. Then you can assess of, hey, did I get the telemetry that I was looking for? Did my controls log that activity? Did it generate an alert? Was it supposed to? Did it block that activity? Was it supposed to? And you could start iterating through these isolated actions of an actor and understanding how your controls are operating in the background. So you can at least automate those actions, and there's tooling out there that will walk through of how to actually do this yourself. They're free and open source. But that is probably the best place to start of understanding, hey, I have this intelligence. We saw that Alpha Black Cat, for example, they perform what's known as a Kerberos attack. I don't necessarily need to know anything about Kerberosing, but I can look at that technique ID, figure out some more intelligence. I could identify tools that can do that for me, and then actually run that in a simulated environment. At least that's a representative sample of my own environment itself, and then assess how my controls are actually operating. You lose some realism and accuracy with that, right? If you're just iterating through each specific action, but it's very easy to run and it's low cost, pretty much next to free, and you can at least get a sense of how your controls are actually operating in the background. Next, a little bit more advanced is something known as a micro emulation. So this is compounding multiple techniques into one singular assessment. So maybe it's focusing on credential gathering as a tactic. You may run several series of credential gathering or how you get to credential gathering, and then assess each part of the chain, each part of the iteration as its own total kind of assessment. So instead of isolating each action an attacker is taking, you're focusing and isolating the tactical objective of what an attacker may try to achieve. Maybe they're running first to run a Kerberos attack, they need to enumerate the Active Directory domain, or they need to identify accounts that are vulnerable. And all those different isolated actions, we could then compound onto each other and then assess how your defenses are doing. And this is going to be a little bit more accurate and realistic of how actors are actually operating. They need to run several commands on their own keyboards when they actually have access of they detonated malware and they have remote control of a computer. They also need to do several actions, and we're essentially compounding those actions to then understand how a behavior is actually operating rather than just isolating a singular technique as we are with atomic testing. Lastly, it's a full emulation. It's from start to finish of, hey, I really care about this ransomware operator and I want you to emulate the Black Hat attack. They perform phone calls. I want you to perform a phone call attack and see how we do against someone trying to impersonate as a help desk to harvest credentials. And not only that, I want you to then go a step further of you have this credential, show me how you're going to then perform that Kerberos attack and take that exact intelligence of that entire mapping and do the same exact playbook, right? We can think of it as a football game. We have the Patriots playbook of we know the exact offense and defensive schemes that they're going to be running. And it's kind of this simulated training exercise that we have. Okay, we understand this defensive playbook. We understand this offensive playbook. Let's collaborate together and run these types of assessments ourselves and see what the outcomes are. Again, that's a little bit more mature and complicated and may require some professional assistance, but that's how you can start establishing kind of a roadmap of the maturity of security testing that could be performed. So, and this is a key point too, from what the defensive reality is and thinking about the complexity as it goes into these types of assessments. For detecting behaviors, right? This is, if I talk about Kerberosing or those password-based attacks or social engineering itself, detecting offensive outcomes is very difficult because from an offensive perspective, I can run a variety of different tools. There's so many open source tools out there that ultimately do the same thing. Yes, they're written in a different type of language of code. They're implemented in different various ways, but ultimately the outcome that I'm looking for as an offensive practitioner, it's going to be the same. Versus detecting it is going to be vastly different, depending how maybe that code was implemented, where the procedure was ran. So that's why I want you to also think about when you're mapping that intelligence, or you're making these types of playbooks and assessments, The intelligence that really matters is, again, the procedure level data of not about the attacker of how they did it tactically, but how they what is that scripts they ran, what is the command lines that they used. That type of information is going to be key for us to then build out our own programs, and it's going to be way more impactful than us trying to guess. It's okay to guess if we have to, but that all goes back to of the intelligence that we have access to and why we're actually running something, rather than just saying, hey, we're going to choose all might or attack and run against 100% of it. That's not going to be worth your time. It's more impactful for us to identify intelligence as meaningful, why we care about it, and then run it through iteratively as we get through these types of plans and assessments. So what does the current security model look like, and why am I talking about it for so long? The current security testing framework looks like, if you've done a penetration test, if you've ever had a penetration test done, right now the scope of testing in terms of, it's usually an annual assessment. You're doing some sort of network-based pen test of, you're looking at the external network perimeter, maybe you're doing an internal network assessment, but you're ultimately planning the assessment, you're identifying the relevant scope. You'll have the perform the testing. Maybe it's in-house. You have security professionals on hand to perform the testing, or maybe it's a third party that does an annual assessment. They're going to draft some sort of findings, and then they'll deliver the report. That's the current security model that we have as it exists today. And unfortunately, with that, of those that have performed a pen test or have conducted one internally, what they'll commonly see is that that report gets issued. If they're lucky enough to do a pen test again, they have the same report findings from year after year. It's very difficult to kind of close and validate that those security gaps or identified vulnerabilities, misconfigurations are actually closed. And that's a common trend that we've seen, where unfortunately it's very hard, where if you're just doing an annual assessment, you may have that issue or seen that issue where you have a drafted report findings of 10 or so issues, and then next year you'll have 8 of the same issues still open. And my thought is always, okay, well, if we're doing offensive security tests, if we're doing a pen test, that's supposed to inform the defensive practitioners, the blue team is what we call it in the industry, of that's supposed to be informing and helping the business bolster the defenses, of we're identifying these gaps to help bolster your defenses internally. And that's a little bit broken right now if we're doing these point in time one-off assessments where we're not ascribing them to a specific threat or why we care about it. Where is it accurate and realistic for this the scenario that we actually ran, and is it actually helping in the long run of how we're actually running these assessments? So that's why I've kind of outlined the new kind of thinking that exists right now in offensive security testing that differs from the historical and legacy approach of just simply doing a pen test just every year for compliance reasons or whatever the case is. It's now shifting towards being more continuous, being more proactive, because what we're seeing is that if actors are still being successful, we saw breach reports of, you can look at the Verizon data breach report. CrowdStrike, for example, they had their annual report summarizing what they're seeing. Actors are still getting in. And if that's occurring, then we need to maybe rethink how we're performing these security testing to help bolster defenses as well. So let's get into actual atomic testing and break down how this actually looks, so you can actually start thinking about this a little bit more deeper. So Atomic Red Team is a solution or community resource that's open source. It's free. It's maintained by Red Canary, which is a security company. But what they allow you to do is they've identified techniques that can be automated and ran in atomic fashion. So they've used the MITRE ATT&CK framework, kind of the entire work that we did initially. They've classified different techniques, and they've helped automate running these techniques. So on the screen here, on the slides, which you should have available to you, but is an example of how to actually install the Atomic Red Team. This uses PowerShell, for example, but it's very easy to at least install. And what you could do is create a workstation or create an endpoint. If you're a hospital system, or if you're really have access to anything, you could simply ask your IT team or security team of, hey, we want to start doing these micro tests, or we want to start at least validating these types of actions if we're receiving these types of reports. You'd essentially create a environment that is a sample representative endpoint where you have the same controls applied, same tooling applied that you normally would have. And from there, you can start automating some techniques. I really care about T1003. That's from the MITRE ATT&CK framework. That's credential gathering. And from there, you can start doing these micro tests, and it's already automated for you. There's test scripts that they've already developed, And you can either do it from a manual fashion of kind of running the commands yourself, or run it through the Atomic Red's Canary suite of using Invoke Atomic Red Team, which is a PowerShell execution framework. So this is already out there. It's open source, and you can start looking yourself and validating these atomic level scale tests of saying, I care about this specific action. I really want to know how we fare. And well, how do my controls actually respond to it? How is my managed service provider going to respond to it? How am I going to respond to it? Those are the types of questions that we should start asking, where we can start verifying ourselves of how our controls are actually working. So just to give an example of what this can look like, let's take password spraying, a very simple and in industry, people will say it's sophisticated attack, but Microsoft, for example, was breached this way. I mentioned it earlier, but it's from the November breach that occurred that an attacker took a list of user accounts or emails, we can think of them as. So think about this yourself. Take a list of your emails that exist internally, and then we're naively just going to guess a password. We're going to take all the list of emails and accounts that we have, and then simply just guess. We're in the month of March. Unfortunately, it's very common for end users to gamify the password policy. I'm hoping that this is not the case for anyone listening in this webinar, but it's very likely that someplace it exists. That a password, for example, of March 2024 exclamation point is a password that is probably out there in the wild. Capital M exclamation point at the end, you have the date there. Or it could be spring 2024 exclamation point. That could be a guess itself. And unfortunately, that's how adversaries are getting in. That's how Microsoft was breached. We don't know what the password was, but it was a very naive approach of just taking a list of users and then imagine you're going to office.com and you're logging into your workstation and just typing in your password. That's obviously done automated and scripted out to do it successfully for account very quickly. But that's essentially all we're talking about, a very naive approach in terms of trying to guess and get access to an account. So this is a MITRE ATT&CK classification of it. You can see T1110.003 is ID. We have the name classifying this action, a description of what it actually means, and then on the right side is the NIST that's event they partnered with MITRE themselves. But you can start looking at here's the controls that may exist of how you can detect or prevent these types of attacks from occurring. You can start inventorying your own controls of, hey, I think my controls are going to operate like this. We have a really strong password policy. It's 14 characters. There's no way you're going to guess a password. And you can put that to the test. You can actually test that assumption and validate that it's actually working. What does it actually look like? Well, you could take the Atomic Red Team suite. I've done that on the left-hand side, and I've ran a password spray in my test environment. Think about this as your own environment itself. But I've essentially ran a test script itself of that ID using an Atomic Red Team suite. And my environment, my Active Directory environment was based on the Game of Thrones universe. But you can see that Hodor was using the same credential as his username, Hodor. And we guessed that credential. Now we have a valid password. That atomic singular action allowed us to then validate in that test environment that we are susceptible to a password spray attack, for an attacker can guess a credential and they now can start accomplishing other objectives. Now recall, this is an isolated event, right? All we're doing is just one singular action and then assessing the outcome from two different ways. One way is we're looking at the offensive outcome. Was I successful or did it fail? The other way from a defensive perspective is, well, what did I get from this? Was I able to prevent this abuse? Did I detect even this happening, right? You can imagine perform each account that doesn't have a correct password. That's a failed logon attempt that's happening in the background. Now we can think of that as, well, that should probably trigger an alert, right? This is happening successfully. It's clearly automated. Hopefully there's some sort of alert or at least logged activity that this is occurring. And I could start tuning my defenses where the next iteration, we could then retest this and hopefully we're in a better spot than we actually were. On the right-hand side, I have a backdoors and breaches card game. If you aren't familiar with that, that's just a gamified way to perform tabletop scenarios. But you can see that, again, similar idea, the description of the attack, how it actually works, tools of how to actually run it. So you can figure out the exact tool the operators are using, and then opportunities to either detect or prevent this type of attack. So again, summarizing the atomic testing. First place you should probably start if you've never done anything like this. Very low cost barrier of entry. You just need essentially an analyst to create a workstation or at least run these test scripts yourself. Very easy and to automate and just see what those outcomes are. But the main goal here is not necessarily to test instant response per se, since it's an isolated one single action, because you have to imagine that this may not be a fair assessment against your entire security stack. It's a very specific one isolated action. Atomic Red Team, it can be very overwhelming. So you may want to prioritize how you're actually doing that. There's calculators out there that MITRE provides of how to identify the top techniques and really start caring about. Don't just run through all of Atomic Red Team and think that you're obviously be able to defend everything in cybersecurity. That's not the case. It's really just to help you get started of understanding of this is what an actor and what an action actually looks like in realistic terms. This is what they're running, and this is how our controls actually defend against it. Another example, for instance, is taking public intelligence. This is from the 2021 Conti ransomware gang report. Conti is a ransomware as a service affiliate group that they had a lot of politics and internal conflicts happen, but their entire playbook got released. A playbook meaning this is exactly the commands that their operators were trained to perform. I mentioned earlier, but these crime syndicates are massive. They have different expertise. This is taken from an exact playbook that was translated from Russian to English, but it's running through. This is the commands that they're going to be running on a Windows workstation, the exact test scripts. I could take this exact block of code and then run it and see exactly what the outcomes are. I can classify these techniques and get an understanding of, hey, is this something I should be alerting on? Maybe that's a question I should ask. Maybe I won't be able to prevent it. That may be too difficult for me to tune my environment. But this is a great place to start of taking actionable intelligence and then actually running through and assessing how your defenses are actually operating. So again, just thinking about Atomic Red Team, just to harp on this a little bit more, you can look at public intelligence, take a look at those playbooks. You have to think about, is this actually a fair assessment as a whole to your EDR systems? It may not be because of the isolated instance. You may want to be a little bit more mature and methodical to use something like a microemulation or Purple Team if you wanted to test full incident response or get a little bit more complexity involved. But this at least helps you run through iteratively and be efficient as possible when you're running through those basic test scripts that you do have control over. These are another examples. I'll let you read through these when you have the slide deck if you're interested. But again, kind of similar approach of we could take a different test case of T1219 remote access software is very commonly used by threat actors. That's installing things like TeamViewer, AnyDesk, or Screen Connect. That's oftentimes, I'll say right now, not detected by EDRs. It's not going to trigger an alert. But that's essentially the kind of point that you can try yourself of what are these lower risk opportunities, or how I can actually tune and ensure my defenses are able to defend against these types of techniques. Because you may be surprised, some of these techniques may trigger a low level alert, and then it's a question of how do I actually maybe retune that? Maybe I can reclassify that to be a moderate or high because my environment's different, or it's up to you to kind of gauge of what is actually important during your actual journey as you perform these kind of test scripts and security assessments. My last point here in regards to actually thinking about this in terms of being able to actually successfully add and increase accuracy and realism is, instead of using kind of that isolated procedure of just one action, one tool, command and control is how actors are getting in, right? They're capturing credentials. They need to get a foothold into an actual endpoint. And to accommodate that, they need to use a command and control framework. If you've never heard of that, that's essentially how actors are able to remotely control your endpoint from the internet. They need some sort of malicious process or software that gets installed on an endpoint to then facilitate that remote control, to then spawn off these different actions and procedures where they can then pivot off to different systems, but all spawns from this initial implant or malware that got installed on the actual endpoint. So understanding that we could use the same thing. A lot of these are open source and commercial tools, but something to think about that if you wanted to increase the realism, there's MITRE Caldera, for example, that can help assist with that. But Cobalt Strike is very common. That's used by ransomware operators. It's a commercial tool that got leaked or is constantly used. Sliver is maintained by Bishop Fox. It's open source and free. Mythic, another example, maintained and assisted by SpectreOps. These are all tools essentially to help facilitate that type of testing. I merely just mentioned it just to help you understand that there's a way to get more accurate and realistic rather than just writing those isolated test scripts as we just talked about as a primer and example. So lastly, I'll mention with the slides that I have, threat emulation, you can make a plan. This is what this assessment can look like. Start with intelligence first, work your way towards up actually identifying why and what you actually want to test against. And then from there, you can get an evaluation and retest specific actions depending on what the gaps you identified were. There's a penetration testing or purple team exercise framework itself. I've listed it down below. That's a really good start of getting more context of if you wanted to establish this framework yourself internally. Really good place to start. And I have some audit logging cheat sheets and other resources to help. But with that, I'll pause and take any questions if there are any.
So I apologize, Alex. This one came up earlier in your presentation. It says, Pat's asking, sometimes she comes across news links that sends a "you have been hacked" message. Has the news source been hacked, or are they set up purposely to do that? A question.
It's probably purposely set to do that, right? I'm imagining what you're seeing is that it's trying to invoke fear in response. You go to a site and it's a malware site or malicious site that these operators or these gangs have created just to invoke fear and a response of saying, hey, if you've been hacked, go see this page or something to that effect. They're probably just doing that to invoke fear and hoping that you create a mistake or you enter credit card information or call this phone number is usually pretty common. Call this phone number for IT assistance. That's how they get people on the line, and they try to get access through that means of just invoking fear. So I don't think it's a case that those websites have been hacked. It's more likely that's a fake website and has just been created to invoke fear in response and try to get access. Essentially, is the point I'd make.
So we do have a few minutes here. If anyone does have any questions for Alex, you can either put them in the Q&A or the chat, or if you would like to use the raise your hand feature, I can also unmute you if you'd like. But thank you so much, Alex, for taking, and thank you to Wolf for taking the time to present to our membership today. I did put a link to his presentation in the chat, but I also will be sending it tomorrow along with the CP Hymns credit and a link to the recording on our New England Hymns YouTube channel. And Alex is saying thank you, great presentation. And if anyone is interested as well, we have an in-person meeting tomorrow evening, Empowering Women in Diversity in Tech, Strategies for Career Advancement, and that is going to be in Sturbridge at the barn at White Farm. So feel free to come and speak to some of Alex's cohorts. They will be there at a sponsor table. So again, thank you, Alex, for joining us. If anyone does have any questions, his email address is there, and or you can send them to me at newenglandhymnsag@gmail, and I will get those to Alex as well. So thanks so much, Alex, and thank you to everyone for joining us today.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Alex.